The adventure of a scientist is the same adventure of an entrepreneur, and the same adventure of a storyteller, which means you start a story, you start your research, you start a product, but you don't really know where this story will lead you. And that's kind of the fascinating part of scientific research, because you start with an hypothesis, you work on it, and then you realize that at a certain point there's a twist in the plot. And this twist generates maybe something else, or maybe the real thing that you were looking for. So in this sense, the scientific mind is an entrepreneurial mind, or a storytelling mind that accepts change, that accepts the twistings of the twists of a plot, that accepts that something new might come and might develop.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. Hello and welcome, everyone. My guest today is Dr. Luca Cottini. He's an associate professor at Villanova University and the host and creator of the YouTube show Italian Innovators. Luca holds a PhD from Harvard University, an MA from the University of Notre Dame, and a BA from the University of Milan. He was trained as a classical philologist in Italy and a cultural historian in the US. His interests touch upon Italian literature, visual arts, and intellectual history of the 19th and 20th centuries, and on the birth of Italian industrial culture, advertising, and design. His books include a monograph on Italo Calvino and a cultural history of the origins of Italian design called The Art of Objects. His YouTube show explores the Italian model of entrepreneurship and innovation through cultural profiles, interviews, and lessons across different disciplines like fashion, food, technology, sports, music, and engineering. Luca, such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Brandon. It's a pleasure being with you.
Great. Well, I'm enjoying fine Italian innovation here, an espresso. It's not a real espresso, but it's one of those instant things. But, it's the best we can do these days. So
Absolutely.
Tell me, what attracted you to study design and innovation?
So I'm a classical philologist, and moving to the United States, I started to observe Italian culture not only from the perspective of literature, which is a very high pitch on a culture, but I started to include the vision of kind of middle brow and lower brow arts or languages, or perceived as such, like fashion, design, advertising, cinema, photography. And I started to include them in a holistic vision of Italian culture, bridging the canonic separation between what are called like the literary studies and what are called the material studies. So design is a space in between the strategic mindset, business, entrepreneurship, and the creative mindset. So the creation of an imagery, of an imagination of a culture, which comes in the visual arts and literature. So in this sense, design as a word means two things in the Italian context. In the English sense, design means planning. It has to do with engineering. But in the Italian sense, disegno, design means drawing. So the activity of design is an activity that combines strategic thinking and creative thinking, the drawing of a vision, which is basically the combination of generalism and particularism, or the collocation of the parts within a universe of meaning. In this sense, also the word engineering is a two-way word. It comes from the Latin word ingenium, which means kind of the strategic mindset, but also is the word that is behind the word ingenuity in English, so the creative aspect. So in this sense, I observe the Italian model as a significant case, or rather a unique case, where a culture produces a model of innovation that is both aesthetic and strategic, or entrepreneurial or scientific, if we want. So in this sense, in observing Italian culture from a holistic perspective as a design or a deliberate design, I trace in my show and in my research the model of, or an alternative model of entrepreneurship that aims at innovating not just the functioning of objects, but also their meaning, to make them important. The word important comes from importare, which means to mean something. So that's where I am, and that's where I think Italian culture can provide an interesting model of reflection also to the American context.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm really interested in is, the contributions of Italian culture, and particularly the aesthetic culture in Italy over time, to innovation, particularly in the sciences. And it's perhaps no accident that Galileo is considered the father of modern science. What do you think might have contributed to that? Like, even the Renaissance is one of the sort of key, contributions, I suppose, of Italy to the world. And what's going on in that context that produces someone like Galileo and allows the kind of scientific creativity and innovation that we see with him?
Well, thanks for asking. Galileo is an interesting case because he was actually the son of one of the musicians, composers, that launched the movement to revive the ancient sung theater, which then ended up in the creation or recreation of opera as melodrama, action sung in Greek. So Vincenzo Galilei was a composer, a musician, and I absolutely think that Galileo, so the son's activity, was influenced by this humanistic take on reality, meaning this intellectual endeavor to literally read through, interlegere, which is the origin of the word intellectual, to read through, to connect the dots, to see a particular aspect of reality as part of a whole, of a broader sky. So it is actually quite fascinating that Galileo is a paradigm of entrepreneurial thinking, but also of creative thinking. In the one sense, because Galileo was the first who really shifted planes in observing or in adopting the telescope. The telescope was already in use by the Dutch, and it was mainly used, prevalently used in sea navigation as a tool for maritime exploration. Galileo was the first one who shifted planes and said, well, why don't we use this to actually observe the sky? And that's how he kind of found out an original discovery. On the other hand, Galileo is also a creative mind because the impact of his discovery was filtered through drawing. And it's actually quite fascinating to see in the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, the first book he published in 1611, where he drew literally the observation of the moon that he conducted in Padua in 1609. And it's quite fascinating that, like, a scientist feels the need to draw this, going back to the idea of disegno as drawing. And at the same time, then in the dialogue on the two chief word systems, actually Galileo adopts fiction to convey the scientific theory, the heliocentric scientific theory. So it's quite remarkable that a scientist adopts a fictional dialogue to promote a scientific theory. Who of us would do that now? In this sense, his kind of contemporary mirror can come from the Italian scientist Fabiola Gianotti, who is the head of the research center, the CERN in Geneva, that found out the Higgs boson. She was actually the one who announced it in 2012. And what is fascinating about Fabiola Gianotti is that she actually has a degree in piano. So once again, the connection between music and science. This is quite interesting to me because, like, if I observe the starry sky at night, what I might see, very cynically, is actually a blue background with infinite dots that might not make much meaning in say. And I might observe one, I might focus on one, losing the awareness of the constellations, or I might see dots, one in connection with the others, and see how a dot is part of a larger constellation of meaning. This is where I think the beauty or the creative element helps or enhances the scientific research, kind of lifting the gaze from a myopic emphasis on a detail to kind of a larger understanding of the position of each dot within the universe. This is particularly helpful, and this is also part of many of the speeches that you can find on YouTube by Fabiola Gianotti. I absolutely recommend them. So in this sense, I will reframe the idea of STEM, which is what normally associate to only a scientific, technological, kind of engineering, mathematical paradigm, to something different. So I will reframe the acronym into scientia, which is actually the earlier word for science, which in Latin actually meant just knowledge as such. After Galileo, the word science came to indicate only the knowledge that we acquire through a particular process. So the scientific method applied to the natural sciences too. But scientia, in its earlier origin, actually identified all knowledge of reality, also including the humanities. So in this sense, also Dante was a great scientist. There are a lot of parts of astronomy in the Divine Comedy. So science as this understanding of the humanities and technology together. Then there is a word with T, which is the word techne. It's a Greek word which actually means both art and technique. So the idea that in order to do something well, you need art to do it. You need a certain craft in doing it, not just the understanding of details, but really the zeal for details. Then E, I would think of it as entrepreneurship, or as the energy of realization, because you can have a great idea, you can find a great idea, but how to communicate it and how to realize it in a product, say in the industry, requires a particular creative energy and strategic energy. And the last one is marvel, because an object without marvel or an object without a story cannot endure. And I normally use the example of the company Nike to explain this. Imagine the company Nike without the swoosh, the logo, the visual representation, or without the three words, just do it, that are associated or that associate the brand with a particular narration of movement, dynamism, athleticism. Without that visual communication, without that marvel, that branding, or the fictional communication of Galileo generates, the object will remain bare, would lose its appeal. And that is how many innovations in the sciences, in technology, actually lose traction and lose their power. Once again, Jobs was the one who really was able to connect a functionality that was already existing into a powerful narration of ourselves in the world with the iPhone. That's how this became something relevant and not just a crazy idea.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I mean, I think that there's a lot of themes here that you touched on. I'd love to pick up on. One of them was the link between parts and the whole, right? Which is a sort of a classical feature of beauty, proportional relationships between the parts and the whole. And I think even Werner Heisenberg talked about that as being sort of the key definition of beauty, is this that link. The challenge, I suppose, in a lot of science today is the sort of hyper specialization that a lot of folks are feeling, right? Where we've heard, in the scientists I've interviewed, a number of them saying, I really feel like a narrow, over specialized technician. I only know one small aspect of my subfield, and I have no ability to connect anything I'm doing to the bigger picture, right? And so certainly those who are able to see the big picture are able to experience a sense of beauty. Do you think that the education system in Italy has been able to preserve this ability to see the big picture, to connect these dots, as you're saying, or do you find that even the cultural context there has become to some degree infected by this sort of plague of overspecialization. What is your sense of the context in which scientists today, or even folks in the humanities, are being formed in Italy?
Well, this is something that relates to Italian culture in general, and that might be an interesting contribution to a different understanding of ourselves here in the United States. The first thing I would say about Italian culture is that in the education system, the humanities have a more predominant position. So it's a humanities-centered kind of education, whereas here it's kind of like a STEM-centered form of schooling. In this sense, the humanities provide a holistic understanding of a culture, which might find a reflection in the peculiar Italian setting or in the pure Italian creation of movements that are in se interdisciplinary. If you think about the Renaissance, the Baroque, or in modern times, Futurism or Neorealism, they are all movements that start from a dominant aesthetic idea and apply it through different languages. So the Renaissance is not just painting, but it's the idea of the harmony of parts, the rediscovery of the classics, applied in painting, in sculpture, in architecture, in theater, in literature as well. In the same way as the aesthetic idea of modernity and the future that the futurists bring forth applies to the vision of design, photography, literature, theater. So this is an interesting model. Instead of like an over specialization on one idea disconnected from all the other languages, instead the ability to turn one single idea, one innovative idea, into a platform to create different languages that are informed by that idea, but have their own autonomy. In this sense, a good equivalent for the industrial world can come from the industry Campari, the drinks, the aperitif. And Campari is really an interesting avant-garde in marketing communication because they turn a drink, a red drink, into a platform that can generate different other languages. So they invested a lot in photography. They invested in cinema. So just to give you a sense, Fellini and Sorrentino, the last Italian director to win the Academy Award, did mini movies for Campari. Campari started to promote architecture, became really one of the platforms for the development of new architectural structures. So the idea of one overarching idea that kind of spreads and permeates other linguistic forms or aesthetic languages, reinventing them anew. And the last thing I would say about Italian culture is that it's a very relational culture. So the social dimension of relations translates into products that are tools for a dialogue and not just tools for trade in the sense of just monetary exchange. And the relational structure or the relational space par excellence is the piazza. So the place where people get together, where identities are negotiated, even in conflictual terms, if you want, but where people truly engage with each other and are truly communicating something to each other. This is something that can become translatable on the internet, but too often is not, because the internet tends to relegate the individual bodies in their individual kind of compartments. It's actually way more convenient. But this generates first miscomprehensions, and then a flat dimension of the product as just something that produces a monetary functional value, when the actual value of the product is the story and the breadth that it contains and how it means something to us. And this is something that we can learn from the Italian environment, certainly.
Well, can you tell me from your experience of, the various examples of innovators you've studied in the last little while, are there examples that stand out to you of how encounters with beauty have spurred creativity or innovation? Is there anything that comes to mind that can help illuminate what role beauty plays in that process of innovation?
There are certainly in the industrial environment numerous examples of the relationship between the industry and the creation of beautiful environments. I would name three. One is the example of Ermenegildo Zegna. It's kind of the leading company in the wool production of wool. It's one of the top fashion brands. What is interesting is that the company, which was founded in northern Piedmont, northern Italy, in the 1910s by Ermenegildo Zegna, launched in the 1930s an incredible project of reforestation around the factory, the main plant. So in the 1930s, the founder planted 500,000 trees around the plant to create what now is called an oasis, Oasi Zegna, which has become kind of a protected area. His whole idea was to connect the production of wool to the beauty of the natural environment. So to bypass the kind of inevitable alienation of work and connect the work on wool to its natural source and also to its natural environment. How many times we lose sense of the nature behind, for example, the food that we eat, where it comes from. And so in this sense, he wanted to connect what we wear, like the production of wool, to that sense of beauty that comes from being part of an environment, of a beautiful natural environment. The second example is Brunello Cucinelli, is the king of Kashmir. In Umbria, central Italy, he created a company which is all based on philosophy. So basically in his board, he has like Benedictine monks, philosophers, and he basically built a little city, or actually a Renaissance city called Solomeo, around the headquarters of the company. The city is based on the ideal Renaissance city. And it's basically an attempt to connect the workers of his company to a balanced and harmonic lifestyle. So he actually offers them a bonus for theater and culture. So they are required to attend like a theater play every month and to spend a certain number of hours in the library. And they are given like a 2-hour lunch break. That's not bad. To connect their work to a life that is meaningful and not kind of deprive work of its breath. The third example is Olivetti. It's probably the most famous. Olivetti was the leading brand in typewriters. Actually, Olivetti was the company that produced the first computer ever, the Elea, in 1959. And it's based in Ivrea, still kind of near Zegna in Piedmont. And Ivrea was conceived as a comunità, a community. So the idea of Adriano Olivetti, who is also the model of Steve Jobs, was to create a working site where architects, designers, workers, philosophers could interact together, similar to the space of Cupertino, if you want. And this also became a political project that didn't go very much far because like Olivetti died very young. But this was the idea of connecting work to society as a harmonic balance of parts and contributions. So I think these are good examples of how beauty connects to innovation, technological innovation. In a way, if you want to go back to the Renaissance, also Leon Battista Alberti, who was the one who discovered perspective, was the one who really connected the understanding of geometry to the design of architectures. If you go to Florence, the facade of Santa Maria Novella, it's like a beautiful church near the train station, is actually based on geometric forms applied to space. So how to use math as a geometrical form that inspires beauty and uplifts kind of our souls in a way, in observing it. So this can be good examples, then there are many more, but
Yeah. No, there's a lot of interesting insights there. Would you say that there are any sort of unique or distinctive aesthetic principles that come out of the Italian context, or that characterize, say, if we look at scientific or technological innovation in Italy today, are there any particularly distinctive or common aesthetic principles that are sort of particular to that context?
I would not call them principles, but more frames or frameworks, in the sense that if we compare the Italian and American approach or frameworks to innovation, we might see certain differences. Well, we highlighted the difference between kind of a technological approach and a humanistic approach, which might also be read as a difference between kind of a short-term, immediate solution approach versus a long-run, longer continuity approach. And this
I think of Cucinelli's got like a 200 or 500 year vision or something like that.
Not a 3-year range, but a 300-year range. And this translates, for example, in the approach to management. Managers in the Anglo-Saxon world tend to move from one company to another and execute what they are asked to do in the short run. Entrepreneurs in the Italian context are more like medieval captains in a way. So they are the ones that are interested in running what in Italian is called impresa, which means both company and adventurous feat. That's quite a remarkable overlapping of terms. And if someone is running this impresa, this feat, has the interest to prolong this impresa over generations. So this is where the family model comes from. We see it in a negative sense in the house of Gucci, but for example, in the case of Zegna, which arrived at the 3rd generation, we see how instead this model generates continuity over time and also loyalty over time. We see this also in Illy Caffè, the 3rd generation, in Lavazza as well. Or, for example, in the craziest example, in the company Marinelli, located in Molise, southern Italy, which is the longest running company in the world. It started in the Middle Ages and produces bells. So it's been going on for 8 centuries. So this is the idea of entrepreneurship as a long run adventure. So this might be one framework, technology versus humanities. The idea of like the short-term solution versus kind of the long-run horizon. The last one is kind of the opposition between the pioneering framework of the American West, if you say, so the new frontier framework, innovation as finding a new uncharted land or territory, which then translates into the conquest of the West, the conquest of space, the conquest of whatever else is more West than where we are. And the Italian model of innovation, which I equate to the model of the snail, which is to look backwards to move forward. So the idea of heritage or tradition as something that is given from the past and is not rejected to make room for something new, as in the dynamic of fashion or moda, modernity, but it's actually rediscovered and used as a vital force to create new grounded solutions. Now, the pioneering model is actually a model that produces new ideas, but also produces a lot of like ideas that fade pretty quickly. If you think about science, what we call science is what is left of a number of scientific hypotheses that the vast majority that faded over time. So in this sense, also products, what we see, or classics, what we see is what is left of this pioneering attitude that found something, but also left a lot of other things along the way. The Italian model instead is a model where the presence, which is kind of a spatial presence of the past in the geography, in the urban geography of Italy, and the cultural imagination can be seen as a burden or can be seen as a resource. In this sense, design is born out of the reappropriation of something that is in the past as something that grounds innovation, that produces something new, but not flat, new with depth. And this is quite an interesting paradox because we tend to think of originality only in the sense of novelty. But how is it possible to create something truly original and truly substantive at the same time? That's kind of the challenge. And in this sense, the Italian and American models put together can generate very, very interesting solutions.
Yeah. No, that's a fascinating point. Yeah, I've certainly seen this in a lot of Italian firms. I've been working with a team of sociologists at the Università Cattolica in Milan, and they're looking at organizations that are exemplars of social generativity, and they do find that there's a certain model of innovation that is grounded in tradition and also identity, right? So this idea of in this region, this is what we have been producing for centuries, and so there's a certain kind of rootedness, a certain kind of tradition, which doesn't really have to enslave you. You can certainly deviate, but there's also that sense of fidelity to something that's been given, and I suppose it provides a more stable, foundation from which to innovate, perhaps.
You're listening to Beauty at Work.
Do you see, one of the things I want to ask you about is whether there's a dark side to beauty. So in, I'll give you an example in some of the work, some of the debates that are going on in say, theoretical physics, actually around CERN and particle physics and so forth. There's an argument that on the one hand, beautiful mathematics can be a guide to truth. It's what leads people to develop ideas for what to investigate, what to invest their money in investigating, what kinds of hypotheses to pursue. And so you go for the ones that are most mathematically elegant and beautiful, trusting that beauty will lead you to truth. However, in the last 50 or 60 years, that approach somehow hasn't been working. And people have argued that we're wasting our time and we're wasting our money pursuing beauty where it's no longer going to be fruitful. So essentially the argument is it's become a source of cognitive bias. So I'm curious to know what you think about beauty or aesthetic principles as, in spite of whatever advantages they have, could they also be perhaps a blind spot? Could they also close us off to innovation or to directions that we might otherwise take?
Well, thank you. This is a really interesting space. I would say a couple of things. One, related to the opposition that took place between the 16th and 17th century between two aesthetic systems, one the Renaissance system and the other one the Baroque system. And the second observation relates to the importance of fiction for scientific research and for technological innovation. The first thing, well, the Renaissance, as you know, is kind of a harmonic system that works well, looks nice, but imposes a very rigid frame on other possibilities, simply. So in this sense, the beauty, the harmonious beauty promoted by the Renaissance, later by neoclassicism, is more of an ideological beauty. I tend to see kind of the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo as an impossible man, the man inscribed in the circle and in the square, or rather as a forced man, someone who is forced to enter or to fit within those parameters that we imposed. Well, the Vitruvian Man does not exist. I have never seen someone who has the exact proportions of the Vitruvian Man. Our body is different. So in this sense, what the Baroque promotes is more of an irrational side, the emphasis on the darker side, on something we cannot really control, or on impulses, on the forces and dynamism that might lead also to entropy. So there is a value in the beauty of entropy for scientific research. So the study of complexity, not as a study of systems that are already pre-formatted, but the study of complexity as something that appears perhaps randomly, perhaps through the emergence of an irrational force. Now, Nietzsche observed the contrast between the Renaissance and the Baroque through the contrast of the Apollinian and the Dionysian spirit. Actually, Nietzsche was the first one who rediscovered the Baroque as a valuable vital force and not as a grotesque, bizarre, negative art as it was portrayed in the 18th century. So in this sense, when we talk about beauty, we need to figure out what kind of beauty are we talking about, or models of beauty. The model of the harmonious classicism, or the model of beauty as a punch in the face that sparks a reflection. And in this sense, we all have movies that we like, and this binary opposition translates into those who like movies that are well framed, beginning, development, end, maybe with the cheesy end, or movies that really punch you in the guts and that open up a space of reflection. And that space of reflection might generate more knowledge than the cheesy sensation or feelings that we might have in a more fully formed movie. Now, this leads me to the second consideration on fiction, because fiction is really a space of test. It's a virtual space where we test ideas, where we see if moral categories or maybe certain ideas in science, think of like science fiction, can work or not. In a way, in entrepreneurial terms, this is kind of the forerunner of what we call now virtual reality. So fiction is based upon the premise, well, let's pretend this is this. It opens a bubble in our world, which is something that does not exist. Theoretically, fiction is a lie. But through this bubble that does not exist, we might understand if certain categories work beforehand, before making an investment, a heavy investment on them. This kind of the virtual reality proposition, but also to understand and see things that might be more visible there than in the direct vision of reality. So in this sense, fiction as a cognitive space that allows us to postulate ideas, to imagine new horizons. We tend to think of imagination as something that is fake or false, but actually imagination is the space where we allow ourselves to exit our pre-formatted knowledge and kind of brainstorm other possible ideas. So in this sense, imagination and fiction as testing grounds, but also places where we reframe problems beyond the somewhat superficial logic of the immediate solution. Because sometimes the immediate solution is not what we're looking for. It's actually the reframing of the problem that allows us to see actually the bigger solution, what we are really interested in. In this sense, if I may add a conversation I had with an Italian designer, this might be an interesting example. I recently interviewed Gianfranco Zaccai, who is the designer of the Reebok pump and above all of the Procter & Gamble Swiffer. So in talking to him, we actually explored this question of how do you innovate in the field of the industry? In this sense, how do you innovate the idea of like mopping a floor? There were like hypotheses of chemists that said like we need better detergents. There were hypotheses of people who said like based on experience on their frame, we need better mops. What he did was basically to reframe the problem. So he started living with people and observing how they interacted with the issue mopping the floor. And he realized that like for many of them, cleaning the mop required more time than cleaning the floor. Second, that after cleaning the floor with water, there was a film left on the floor of water and either dust or human cells. And so what he did was like to propose this apparently crazy idea of using electrostatic energy to capture dust. And so the idea was to basically mop floors without water. So in this sense, the idea of imagination, also experiential imagination or fiction, is something that allows us to not find an easy solution, which is basically a variation to what we already know that doesn't lead far, but really to reframe the problem, to open a new paradigm. In this sense, to go back to the Baroque might open this paradigm up or open this position up more than kind of the harmonic disposition or harmonic beauty that we associate to kind of Renaissance figures.
That's really fascinating. And it also, I think, echoes the problem that a lot of people have with, say, science, where they don't see it as a space of creativity. So a lot of young people don't choose to go into math and science because they see it as more of a rigid, sort of indoctrination into formulas that one has to regurgitate on tests and so forth, right? And so it's really unfortunate. And I think cultivating that sense of creativity and innovation, problem solving, redesigning, your approach to your question in the first place seems to be really a critical component of the kind of education that might be needed to draw new people into the sciences and for the revitalization of science. Do you see any other interesting aspects of the relevance of beauty for science and technology and say for the future of, say, either trust in science or the development of the sciences?
Well, in a way, this relates to also technology and entrepreneurship. If I think about science, or rather engineering, the first example that comes to mind is Corradino d'Ascanio, who is the engineer who designed the Vespa scooter, but who is actually the engineer who designed the first helicopter. So the idea of this understanding of beauty as a holistic space where planes are connected refers to him because basically in his work in designing helicopters, the principle was that of building bodies for flying objects that were both light and sturdy. You can have like a heavy material for flying. And this principle was the principle that was behind the construction of the scooter, or rather the reconfiguration of the scooter in post-World War II Italy. But the scooter was actually invented by Americans. It was a vehicle used by American parachuters that were like thrown pretty much behind the enemy line in Italy and used this kind of like two-wheel vehicle that had like a lot of agility and mobility to go around the enemy lines. What D'Ascanio saw was the combination of this vehicle with a new urban setting that was developing after the war, where roads were all kind of bombed, and the only way to go around with was light mobility. And also light mobility is great in Italian cities, and that are very narrow. And so in this sense, he applied the concept of the light and sturdy body of the airplanes or the helicopter to the construction of this vehicle. And that's how the Vespa came about. This, to me, is an example of a scientific mind. The idea of connecting dots, observing reality, and finding applications of an idea or a theory that might go beyond kind of the immediate outcome and create other. So in this sense, this open mind or open mindset, then, well, the whole idea of science as a field that is somewhat objective or, say, separated by reality, if I may oppose to it an idea of science as instead the place where we enter in a dynamic relationship with reality, where dots are connected, I would like to also add the case of Adriano Ducati, who was the first one who in the 1920s developed a part in radios that allowed him to be the first one to start a radio communication from Italy to the United States. And he did it in Bologna, which was the city of Marconi. That was kind of the culture upon which he built this whole understanding of radios. And basically, Ducati in the 1920s and 30s in Italy was the leading company in the production of radios, cameras, video projectors, and also kind of razors. What is interesting is that like Ducati was bombed in 1944 by the Americans, and nothing was left of this. So what Ducati did was to basically accept this not as the failure of his own enterprise, but really as a possibility to develop something else. So going back to the idea of the roads that were bombed, he basically developed a little clip-on engine to attach to bicycles, so light transportations, that had a lot of success. And that's how he basically started like the motorcycling part of the company. Now nobody knows that Ducati was a radio company. Everybody knows that Ducati is the most incredible motorcycle company in Italy. It's kind of the Ferrari of motorcycling. I'm saying this because like the adventure of a scientist is the same adventure of an entrepreneur, and the same adventure of a storyteller, which means you start a story, you start your research, you start a product, but you don't really know where this story will lead you. And that's kind of the fascinating part of scientific research, because you start with an hypothesis, you work on it, and then you realize that at a certain point, there's a twist in the plot. And this twist generates maybe something else, or maybe the real thing that you were looking for. So in this sense, the scientific mind is an entrepreneurial mind, or a storytelling mind that accepts change, that accepts the twistings of the twists of a plot, that accepts that something new might come and might develop. And last example is an automobile producer who, Bugatti, everybody knows Bugatti, is like the American pronunciation. Ettore Bugatti was actually the son of Carlo Bugatti, who was a furniture designer, was actually one of the most important furniture designers in Europe. Some of his works are in the top museums of the world. In Italian, the word furniture is mobile, and the word for automobile is automobile. So the idea of turning an automobile into a mobile beauty. So the idea of challenging a somewhat immobile idea of beauty and taking beauty instead as a dynamic force that accompanies the research, that accompanies the journey of an entrepreneur, of the journey of a storyteller. Because the beauty of the journey, the beauty of scientific research is actually the road we walk to find out a new thing, a new idea, a new story. Without that road, every achievement would be bereft of satisfaction, or would be deprived of its horizon of beauty. And in this sense, I think of scientific research as something that builds our own humanity and feeds our own thirst for something that is truly substantive, that is grounded, and that is also new, because we want to see something new. We constantly pursue novelty, but we also want this novelty not to be ephemeral, but really to be lasting over time too. And the beautiful thing of entrepreneurship, of scientific research, of academic research, is actually the tension to bear fruits, or in other words, the word profit, which in Latin means benefit, and it indicates not just the monetary profit, but the real profit of the work, which is the joy, the satisfaction, the social value, the richness that comes from our own enterprise. In this sense, I'm indebted to like someone like Galileo. I'm indebted to someone who like Ducati, because they enriched my life. The profit of their work was more in their own self-building and in the creation of goods for everybody. Sorry if it kind of a longer answer, but like it's just like to reframe scientific research from this kind of narrow scope to kind of this broader connection to our own human story and our own human journey. That is where science becomes truly, truly, truly interesting. Well, the last example, that came to my mind now is actually the Pietro Catelli, who was like an entrepreneur in the pharmaceutical sector. He produced like syringe, and he produced like the most famous syringe in Italy. And at a certain point, he realized that he needed to improve the medical service especially to children, by creating an environment or a constellation of services for children. That's how he created Kiko, which American calls Chico. It's like the largest childcare brand. So the idea of connecting science to the overall understanding of the child, not as a bundle of scientific needs, but also as a bundle of psychological needs, and also as a protagonist of a life that will be developing in truly remarkable ways that we don't know yet.
Wait, so let me ask, so this is super fascinating. I suppose one of the things that might be helpful to conclude with is perhaps some advice on what we can do in our own journeys, whatever those might be, to stay open to this kind of adventure, right? Where you may not know essentially where you're going to be led. And you might have to contend with failure, just as Ducati did and others, right? Where you come across unexpected obstacles. And perhaps you need intellectual humility as well to be open to surprise, that perhaps things won't really work out the way you expect them to, or might take a totally different direction. What does it take to cultivate that sense of intellectual humility or openness to adventure and not to give up in the face of failures?
Well, thank you. This also leads me to kind of trace another parallel between American culture and Italian approach, which relates to the aspect of competition. American culture is a competition-driven culture, society, which tends to see failures or kind of losses as the collapse of every attempt or endeavor. And this is kind of a moralistic approach to research, because there is no research that does not entail failures. Actually, failures are the only condition to learn and to bring new ideas forth, and not kind of protect ourselves in a safe space where we say we innovate, but we're actually doing the same thing with a slight variation to be on the safe side. The opposite of competition in the Italian milieu that I would like to point is the creative notion of limit. The idea of limit not as an obstacle, but rather as a resource, as a creative resource. In this sense, a culture that is well-fed, like the American cultures, has apparently endless resources, thinks of limit in kind of a little bit less than a culture like Italy that has constraint as its center. Everything is difficult in a way, both geographical constraint, social constraint, and not like this general endless availability of resources. Now, in this sense, limit is not an obstacle, but actually is the condition that forces us to think on how to use well what we have. You think about cooking, well, you can have like the nice part, the nice chunk of the key ingredient of a recipe, or and forget about what is left over, or you can start from the leftover and use the leftover creatively. And this is how Italian cuisine actually developed. It's a cuisine that interpreted the leftover in a creative sense. Limit was also the creative force behind the emergence of Ferrero. So Nutella, Nutella, was born because, like in the post-war years in northern Italy, in Piedmont, Michele Ferrero faced a scarcity of cocoa that was not available during that time. And the only ingredient that was available in his region was actually hazelnuts. So what he did was he saw the limit as a creative input to develop the hazelnut chocolate spread that turned into the Nutella. The last limit that we're now used to talk about is actually death. American culture is very afraid of death, and in the Franciscan tradition, death is always addressed as sister death. Why? And in observing this, I want to mention something that comes from my classical studies, so from the Aeneid of Virgil. Virgil, the ancient poet, actually described the gods of the Roman mythology as very sad gods, because he did not envy their endless, meaningless life. And he said, actually, death is what allows us to live our life, not wasting it, because if we were to live forever, we would waste our time. And this is something that unfortunately happens with a lot of like people in the younger generations that like kind of don't have the sense of the limit of their time. And the limit of death is actually what stirs in us the need to formulate new solutions or to leave a sign in the world around us, and actually to make something of our life, to make it a real masterpiece. So the limit, paradoxically, stirs the creative energy to make something interesting of our lives, to make our life the real enterprise, the real jewel. And in this sense, the creative notion of limit is a good antidote to the obsessiveness of competition, which is great. But the word competition actually means competere, to search together. We rarely have this idea of competition as a common search, but we normally abide by I win, you lose mentality.
Yeah. The zero-sum kind of thing. Wow. Well, that's really a brilliant note to end on. Thank you so much, Luca. This has been really enriching and super fascinating. Where can our viewers and listeners find your work? Where would you direct them?
Well, definitely on my YouTube channel, Italian Innovators. You can find more information at www.italianinnovators.com, the website, where you can also find out like about my research, my profile, my story. And I'm always posting every day on LinkedIn, on my personal profile, and on Instagram at Italian Innovators. If you're also interested in my scholarship, you can find my books on Amazon. That's kind of like, and I'm always interested in hearing comments from listeners, and I normally get a lot of ideas and new challenges also from them. So you're always welcome to reach out.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you again, Luca.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the time and the conversation.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out the show notes for more resources from our guest. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If you like the show, please be sure to share this episode with your friends. And also please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out. Music for this show was provided by Venkat Subramaniam, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. This season of Beauty at Work is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. To learn more about this project, please visit wellbeinginscience.com. Also, for the broader project on Beauty at Work, please visit beautyatwork.net.